All right, so today we're going to talk about the pharmacodynamics and behavioral effects of alcohol. So overall, alcohol is a CNS depressant. What's being shown here is a SPECT scan of a brain. I believe we have a male and a female brain, and we're looking at the brain activity as the participants drink more alcohol over time. So when they're sober, this is the level of brain activity that we're expecting from this coronal slice. As we move over, you see less and less and less, right? And we know that because we're seeing more blue and less red. So that means alcohol is reducing the overall brain activity, which is why we refer to it as a CNS depressant. It does this through multiple different ways, but the two main ones are by potentiating the effects of GABA at the GABA A receptor. It is an agonist. It's going to be a positive allosteric modulator that causes an increase in the impact of GABA binding. The specific binding site on the GABA receptor has not been determined yet. It is an antagonist to glutamate. It's technically an antagonist to all glutamate receptors, but it has a specific affinity to the NMDA receptor. It's also going to reduce the release of glutamate. That's going to be a presynaptic effect. I believe it's also going to involve endocannabinoids and the feedback mechanism that is endocannabinoids are usually caused to be released by activation of glutamate receptors, and you can have a feedback loop there where the endocannabinoid can go back and reduce the release of glutamate. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about each of these. Alcohol is going to increase the GABA A function, right? So normally GABA binds, the ionotropic receptor opens, and chloride can flow into the cell typically. When ethanol is bound, and remember we don't know the exact binding site, but we know it's not the same binding site as GABA. It's not a competitive agonist. When it binds, it can potentiate that flow of chloride. It's unclear to me from my different readings about whether or not GABA also needs to be present. I think alcohol can act as an agonist on its own, but I think it might also be able to combine with GABA. But in the short term, acutely, it increases GABA A function. This is not going to be the case long term, but it is the case short term. Right? So these are going to be ionotropic chloride receptors. Alcohol also inhibits glutamate NMDA receptors. So it's known to bind within the transmembrane domain of the receptor. So that means it's going to be in this section of the phospholipid bilayer. So the most likely explanation for that is that it's an uncompetitive antagonist, similar to PCP, in that it's going to sit within the NMDA receptor and block it from working. This seems to be responsible for the memory deficits. So it will impact NMDA at any level, but at higher levels, it has a higher occupancy of NMDA, which means that you're not going to be able to create memories, which is how you end up with a blackout. So most people are fairly familiar with the different effects of alcohol. This is looking at what kind of effects on behavior we see at each blood alcohol content. So 0.2 to 0.3, 0.02 to 0.03 is going to be fairly minimal effects, slight reaction, mild mood elevation. Most people will report that they are sober at this point. At 0.5, 0.6, a lot of people would refer to themselves possibly as tipsy or have a slight buzz. You're sort of less aware of your surroundings. You're not as inhibited. You have mildly impaired judgment. Once you hit the 0.08, 0.10, you're now incorporating a significant amount of cerebellar activity, and you're going to see a loss of motor coordination, slower reaction times, and less caution. A lot of the driving tests that's done with alcohol, like if you had a field sobriety test where you had to touch your finger to your nose or say your ABCs backwards, that's based on cerebellar function. And once alcohol most deeply impacts the cerebellum at this range and above of blood alcohol content, so 0.08 and above. So when you get 0.14 and over, you're going to start seeing major impairment of mental and physical control. That's when you start seeing slurs, blurred vision, exaggerated emotions, people who they feel things a lot more strongly. You'll see this in higher as well, tears or rage, slight provocation. Sorry. Basically, it just gets more severe from this as you get to higher levels. This is going to be a more severe, a more intense version of what you see at the 0.14, 0.16. 0.3 is usually when people would advise you to call an ambulance. They may or may not be conscious, but in a stupor, unaware of their surroundings. Once you hit 0.45, you're going to be in coma. 0.45 BAC is the content that's going to cause death in 50% of the population. So 50% of the people who reach this blood alcohol content will end up dying. So the dose response curve for alcohol is unique in that it can often be biphasic. And by biphasic, I mean it's not a sigmoidal curve that we're used to seeing. It has a peak and then a dip. So a lot of people find that small amounts of alcohol cause relaxation and disinhibition. They find it sort of a stimulating thing. They feel like they can go be more socially gregarious. However, when you get to those higher levels, you start seeing a lot of sedation effects. So the impaired motor function, the stupor, the coma, the death, right? So this is not a clear, necessary, linear progression. So it's what we refer to as a biphasic curve. So one of the things that this is one of those interesting examples that we have where a drug response curve doesn't have to be in that sigmoidal shape that we're used to seeing. So alcohol actually has a lot of effects on other neurotransmitter systems as well that I don't really want to get into, but I want to mention because they're important. So here we've talked about glutamate. It's going to have a receptor antagonist. It's going to reduce glutamate release. In GABA, it's going to increase the GABA-induced chloride influx to cause hyperpolarization. Those are the acute cellular effects. It's also going to increase dopamine transmission in the mesolimbic system, right, in that BTA, the nucleus accumbens circuit. We'll talk about that more in the fourth video. It also causes an increase in endogenous opioid synthesis and release. This is also thought to contribute to the reinforcing effects of alcohol. Opioids and release of endogenous opioids in such as endorphins feels good, and increasing that release reinforces the positive experience of alcohol. However, there's the chronic cellular effects, as typical with brain compensation, are often the opposite of what you achieve in the acute cellular effects. So you have a receptor antagonism of NMDA receptor. If you antagonize NMDA receptors, you're going to upregulate NMDA receptors to help compensate for that. So the upregulation of receptors, you're seeing a rebound increase in that glutamate release to sort of try and compensate for the chronic reduced glutamate release. That means that you're really vulnerable to extreme hyperexcitability and massive calcium influx. Remember, NMDA lets calcium into the cell. If you have large spikes in calcium levels, that can cause neurotoxicity. So this might be how we end up with the brain damage that we see with chronic alcohol use, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So the rebound hyperexcitability of abstinence syndrome, that's referring to those seizures that we see in alcohol withdrawal that we discussed in the case study. The sedative effects, a lot of what people think of as classic effects of alcohol, mostly going to be through the GABA mechanism. There is a neuroadaptive decrease in GABA function. Remember, as an agonist, the brain is going to experience this as a higher level of GABA activity than we usually expect. In order to compensate for that, it's going to reduce the number of receptors, which means you're reducing the inherent inhibition that's within the system. So that can also contribute to the hyperexcitability, so the seizures and tremors that you see. Dopamine is going to be the reinforcement effect. Opioids are the same. Okay, so just one quick behavioral effect of alcohol that I think is particularly interesting is alcohol and its effect on sleep. So the effects of alcohol and sleep get worse as you get older. This is from a documentary that you can watch on Netflix if you want, called The Truth About Alcohol. It's from the BBC. And this guy, who is a ER doctor in the UK, is doing a sleep study where he has a glass of scotch before he goes to sleep and then sees how it affects his sleep quality. And what they find is that the first half of the night is okay. You fall asleep faster often with alcohol, but over the length of the night, you're going to reduce the amount of time spent in restorative stage 3 sleep. So usually stage 3 or deep sleep and longer periods of time there are going to be more healthy. If you get to sleep by drinking alcohol, you're going to reduce the amount of time spent in stage 3 sleep. So on the night of drinking, you're going to have less REM sleep, but the REM rebound occurs the next night. All right. So those are the pharmacokinetic and behavioral effects. Next, we're going to talk about chronic effects of alcohol, including the damage that we talked about from some of those different neurotransmitter systems, as well as tolerance and physiological and psychological dependence.